Good morning, everyone. I'm Jack Davis, Crops Business Management Field Specialist out of the Mitchell Regional Office. And today we have a couple people joining us from our Ness School of Management in Brookings talking on food issues. Thank you, Deepthi and Andrea, for being here and taking the time to present and lead our discussions today. And we'll just have Deepthi go ahead and share her screen and do her introduction of herself, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to join the economic dialogue. So just to introduce myself, I'm Deepthi Kolady, and an associate professor in the Ness School of Management and Economics. This is my 6th year at SDSU, and I do both research and teaching. When it comes to research, basically focus my research on decision-making, producers and consumers' decision-making in the context of farming and food system. So basically, my research interest has a broad, focus. So producers' decision-making and consumers' decision-making in the past have worked on technology adoption issues, focusing mainly on technologies like agriculture biotechnology, the role of policies and markets and decision making. Then on the consumer side, consumer demand for credence attributes such as antibiotic-free meat or carbon-friendly food products, things like that. So that's about me. So my focus today for the dialogue is looking at how the COVID-19 impacted food consumption and then its effect on the whole industry, agriculture industry. So again, this kind of relates to what I do for the research. So how the consumption kind of changes or disruptions influence producers, right? And so why it's important for producers not to focus only on the production level, but why we should focus on what's happening beyond farm gate, and more consumer behavior is influencing producers' decision making. So I thought the COVID-19 kind of showed us how quickly that could affect producers' bottom line and how industry responds. And so the question in front of us now is that COVID is there for almost 2 years now, and consumer behavior has changed. And if some of those behavioral changes stick, how should the industry respond, right? So the industry responses. So basically, okay, can I go here? Okay, my focus today will be, looking at the changes in the food consumption, then how it affected the food companies, ag industry producers, and then again look at what is happening with consumers now, and just kind of discuss what could be the implications for future, how producers can kind of respond to these external environmental changes. So just to start with, this is actually a chart I got from USDA website where it kind of shows the foot traffic in supermarkets and sit-down restaurants. So it's very clear from these charts that there was disruption at both supermarkets and also at the sit-down restaurant, but the disruption was much higher at the sit-down restaurant. So this is something we can easily understand because we have strict lockdown, right? The country, the nation as a whole was locked down for some time, and that is, we see that period, right? The March, and we see what happened here. The challenge was it was not only our nation, but the whole world was kind of in lockdown for some period of time. So this was easily reflected in food company valuations. If you look here, that period March, and it's an interest. I like the chart because it kind of shows this is institutional food services. The red line, meat packers is This blue line, this is S&P 500 companies, the black, and then packaged foods. Among these, grocery stores were, affected, but then they bounced back quickly. This kind of gives us some insights how different food companies kind of affected by the changes we saw before, right? That we're talking about the supermarkets and then sit-down restaurants in the first chart. And when we kind of discuss today, I want you to keep this in your background. This was actually some survey result from Food Business News, and it kind of shows that changes to eating and food preparation due to COVID-19. So this chart kind of shows, based on the survey result, at least 85% of the respondents in the national survey kind of indicated some kind of changes in their food eating behavior, due to COVID-19. That came in different ways, like cooking at home more, snacking more, washing. This is all good, right? Thinking about food more than you usually do. And in the other extreme, thinking about food less than you usually do. So almost 85% of the survey respondents kind of told, okay, they made some changes one way or the other. The question in front of us is it going to be temporary, or are they going to kind of stick with some of the changes, which we don't know yet for sure. And that is the challenge for us. Everyone in the supply chain or food supply chain, we all have to make decisions with imperfect information, right? We don't have perfect information. We need to take decision with imperfect information, and we should have some risk management strategies. But along with that, I want to kind of share this one I found interesting as well, is that eating at home also had its own challenges, and obviously some were forced to do that. 25% of the survey respondents kind of told sick of having to cook more and things like that. That's a good news for us. So they will go back, hopefully, to their previous consumption behavior. But about 35% found new passion for cooking during the pandemic, just to look at individual level behavioral changes. And I know many of you, all of you know how the disruption happened, but I just want to look at this disruption at different levels, because there was like first one with the national lockdown. We had restaurants and school closures. Then there were processing plant closures, meat processing plant closures particularly, and because of the workers being affected. We know what happened with Smithfield and Sioux Falls. And then there are logistical issues. So when it comes to the restaurants and school closures, producers who were kind of targeting restaurants and schools for their as their destination, they have to divert their supplies to food, to grocery stores and food banks or direct consumer marketing. The challenge is it was hard because we need to remember that US has one of the most complex, efficient, and safe food systems or food supply chain in the world. And this is all because we have scale economy here, and we are very competitive when it comes to food supply chain, very efficient. And the COVID-19 kind of tested the resilience of our system to a great extent. The challenge was it was so big, and so we couldn't really quickly adapt to these changes demanded by kind of something outside our control, right? It was an external event for us. But the main challenge was because packaging and logistics. So something that goes for school lunch programs, they kind of package it in a different way compared to what they send for a retail grocery store, the size and everything. So there was those logistical issues. When it comes to the meat processing plants, because they have to close down, that affected the meat production. And then that affected consumer prices, which we all felt at the grocery store. Beef prices went up, pork prices, poultry. And then we have seen, and I will come to that in a bit, producers, especially livestock producers, farm incomes were affected because of the meat plant closures. We have seen a lot of that. It was not only at these levels, but logistically, these kind of issues happened at the shipment locations. Shipping cost increased due to lack of transportation workers, and then slow movement of shipments means, again, slow distribution process, and then it kind of circles back. But if you look at this, producers for us, farmers and ranchers, we could continue what we have been doing even with COVID, right? Because that is the nature of our production method. No farmer has to stop. Hopefully the row crop commodities, the case is different for specialty products or fruits and vegetables grown in California or Florida, where there are a lot of migrant workers. But for highly mechanized, row crop production, we could continue that. But what we have seen is that but still affected the producers, even though we could continue. That shows that we always think commodity prices, we know commodity prices are volatile. We say it has to do with, the weather events or, the things like that. But something like a global pandemic impacting consumption behavior, processing, different parts of the supply chain was impacted by it, right? If you think that if we have the supply chain from the input side till all the way to the consumer, and the whole supply chain was affected because of the COVID. So I'm sure you might have seen something like this before. There were significant changes in commodity futures. So this was actually a chart from one of the USDA reports where they kind of, this was market evaluation for based, in which they did for the May 2020 prices, and this was the baseline. And we could see that almost all the commodities were impacted. The futures prices were impacted because of this disruption caused by COVID-19. So if you look at the livestock sector, we can see that poultry, pork, beef and dairy sectors see sharp decline, and anywhere ranging from 28% to 48% because of the reasons I mentioned. And when it comes to corn and soybean, the two most important commodities for us, we know that the meat plant closures, affect the demand for feed. That should have some impact on corn prices, but there was a global shutdown. So that means the crude oil demand, which is an important part in food supply chain for various reasons, for the transportation, for the fuel, for for the chilling and the fertilizer, everything, right? So crude oil prices was very low. That also affected ethanol plants because ethanol demand went down. That further affected corn prices, if you see some of the reasons. And among these commodities, between corn and soybean, corn was more affected than soybean. Soybean prices was already in struggle or facing hurdles because of the China trade dispute, and overall this disruption further affected soybean prices as well. So if you look into the dairy sector, we know that there are a lot of challenges with the dairy industry. I don't know whether any of you have dairy operation, but for them, because the prices were so low, especially because of the school closures, the demand for fluid milk was substantially affected, and they have to resort to dumping milk. How the USDA stepped up, and they kind of came up with this idea that dumped milk will be counted as milk marketing, right? Under the LGM insurance plan. And only thing is that a cooperative or milk handler should verify the amount of fluid milk dumped. So there was some kind of, kind of protection or safety net there, but dairy farmers were really affected by this disruption. When it comes to the beef, wholesale beef prices jumped 80% and consumer prices were almost 28% more. And there is a lot of scrutiny going on, especially in the meat sector. Now, I'm sure you are following, if you're following the news, you may see that there was a recent USDA report. I think this one, if you go here, the $213 billion meat packing industry faces stricter oversight in Washington. So when was this? So this is because this week, actually, there was a report coming from USDA, which kind of says that the food price increase we saw at the grocery store, more than 50% of that was caused by the price increase for beef and pork, right? And when you look into the beef sector per se, we can see that almost 55 to 85% of the beef market is controlled by, or meat market is controlled by the top four players, and that is the Wall Street article kind of alluding to. So they told there was a lot of pandemic profiteering going on, where kind of companies drive down, driving prices, not driving down, driving prices in a way such that consumer prices go up, but not benefiting producers. That's what we have been seeing. And the beef industry losses are estimated to be around 13 billion. And we have to see, keep in mind that, as you know, the beef sector is a little different from poultry sector, which is kind of highly coordinated production system with a lot of contract farming. And the pork sector also has more integrated supply chain compared to beef. So that might have contributed to more risk-taking by the producers compared to poultry, for example. And I have shown this before. And if you come to the pork sector, this was more or less similar, but the price increase, consumer price was 13% compared to the 28% which mentioned before. Then like dairy, they have to resort to euthanasia in many cases. And if you see the example here, this was a New York Times article that came and kind of discussed about meat plant closures means pigs are grassed or shot instead. And there were very hard stories how the producers were forced to take some drastic steps. And hog industry losses were estimated to be around $5 billion. Poultry faces more or less similar changes like pork and beef industries. Here, producers were forced to discard chicken hatching eggs as they cannot upload products fast enough. So if you look into the meat sector per se, we can see, including dairy, there was a lot of disruptions and producers were forced to take drastic measures, but kind of there was safety net kicked in from the federal relief package, kind of supported them to a great extent, but these were some significant disruptions to the livestock sector per se. So when it comes to the soybean, if you look, there are a lot of issues going on, the China trade dispute. Now we are competing with Brazilians for prices, and USDA is responding by waiving inspection requirements and authorizing crop insurance taxation. So there are safety net measures there for producers, and I'm sure you are all aware of it, but there is the limit to which they can support when these kind of disruptions continue or persist. And again, feed demand due to reduced meat demand, not the meat demand, but the livestock demand also affected the soybean prices. When it comes to corn, it is a very versatile crop. If you think that we use it for not food, feed, and fuel, and ethanol accounts for about 1/3 of the corn crop. But we see that the corn prices were the most affected for various reasons I mentioned. And for many producers, the PLC payments might have clicked in if they were enrolled in the program. And just to give the crude oil scenario idea about the crude oil scenario I mentioned, you can see that here from March 2000, what did we see here? 2019 to March 2020, you can see here, January after, January kind of, we heard about COVID-19 and then what happened in March 2020. So the glut of crude oil in the cloud market caused May 2020, if you look here, futures to fall below zero for the first time in history. So this affected ethanol prices as well, then the corn prices. So even though the price is going, kind of starting to come back now, and we know that ethanol plants are back in operation and demand is picking up, so that's good. So we have been talking about the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 and its impact on the meat sector, the livestock industry, and the crop sector. But I don't want to give really negative information. If you look here, we kind of talked about this COVID-19 affecting consumption behavior, mostly making people to eat at home more, and food away from home decreasing. That food away from home means the eating at restaurants and places. But if you look into, this is a 3-year data from January 2019, 2020, and 2021. And there is food at home, which is the blue bars, and then food away from home is the yellow ones. And then we have total food sales. So we can see that March, April total food sales went down, and then it picked up, and it's going up. But when January, February, we had more food away from home, and then it was throughout 2020, food at home consumption was substantially higher, and until the last April and May, it started to kind of picking up. That means people are starting to eat with the lockdown restrictions going away. They're starting to eat more at restaurants, which is a good sign. But when you compare the 1-year changes in retail sales values, we can see that among food categories, we see a lot of differences. The change. There is a, if you look, this is from -10 to 8% change in fruits and grains. The demand for some food categories are low compared to the last year this time. And we all hear about inflation now, consumer price index going up for some of the reasons we mentioned before. But because, even though we have highly integrated supply chain, it seems like, price signal should guide the demand and supply, and market clearance should happen. We should have a kind of equilibrium price that we call. But unfortunately, because of some of the structural issues like concentration, for example, in the meat sector, or we don't see that kind of price transmission happening from the upstream of the supply chain and between upstream and downstream, right? From consumer prices are high, but that's not getting transmitted to the producers. Producers are not able to capture the price increase we see at the grocery store. So here we can see that price for the fresh fruit, produce, pork, we can see the prices going up, changes in consumer prices for food at home. Okay, this is only for food at home, not for the overall thing. So what are the implications for future? We have looked at the disruption happening at the institutional level, processing level, how it impacted producers, consumption behavior changing, some of them sticking with it, some of the behaviors impacting consumer prices and demand for different kinds of food categories. And we know that consumer, from this experience, above all, we know that the consumer behavior changes affect producers' net incomes. So there was a survey done by Professor Jason Lusk at Purdue University, a nationwide consumer survey. And some of these bullet points I have here came from that survey result. So as per the survey at the Purdue University, they found that during the COVID time, a lot more purchasing of food happened through online channels. So the question then is, we know many of us resort to Amazon, right, to purchase many things. But then Amazon started shipping food and more people relied on online marketing channels. So the survey or the study kind of shows that the grocery stores we see now may look a little different, right? Now we have a Costco in Sioux Falls, and during COVID time, I even ordered things from Costco online because you were kind of afraid to go to Sioux Falls, at the beginning. So they were talking like the grocery stores could become micro kind of filling stations, right? It's not like the big Amazon warehouses, but we know what happened at Hy-Vee and then Walmart. They have online kind of section went up. We were able to pick things from at the curb and things like that. So it could be possible that that kind of trend continues and then becomes more and more online purchases. And another thing, the survey finds out through the industry surveys that there could be a lot more automation in the meat industry, particularly in the packing sector. So that is really good. And we hear a lot about what we call profiteering, right? As I mentioned before, happening in the meat sector because of the concentration in the meat sector. So it is nice to have automation in the industry to address some of the worker, safety issues and, to avoid the shocks like what we had due to COVID, like workers becoming sick and meat plant closures happening. So automation in the meat industry could further increase efficiency and could address some of these issues. At the same time, there are proposals to increase the number of processing plants or making kind of having this USDA inspected facilities for increasing the number. So more and more kind of small producers also could have better access to these processing plants. Then another thing the Purdue survey found out that consumers' interest in locally produced food increased. So that could mean instead of, especially for meat products, they say that now they prefer something more locally produced, even though there is no clear definition about what is local. Is it 400 miles or is it 100 miles or is it within your, state boundaries? So there are a lot of questions about it. So it's very important, I think, for USDA or concerned agencies to have the clear definitions to avoid consumer, kind of having clear information out there for consumers, so they are not duped into buy something which is not local but claimed locally. So there are a lot of issues. I don't want to get into those discussions. But what the survey found out was that there is a lot of consumer interest in locally produced food. Another thing, this COVID further increased consumer demand for more transparency. We know there is a lot of things like sustainable, natural, organic, all these kind of terms we hear a lot, but animal welfare, that is becoming very important. That's why we hear about all these pasture raised, chicken or things like rotational grazing. So more sustainable production practices. So they consumers are demanding more transparency. They demand certain way, demand that food be produced in certain ways. So for producers and ranchers, it is becoming more and more important to kind of see this as more like an opportunity and communicate the way we kind of adapt to this or kind of the sustainable practices we do and communicate this to the consumer. So tracking become more and more important. And we have technologies like blockchain available now. There is actually Wyoming beef. I don't know any of you are familiar. They have blockchain technology so that they can track their production all the way up to the plate, consumer's plate. The idea behind is that they want to kind of have a better share of the price premium paid for their beef at the restaurants or grocery stores. So it is important for us to kind of be aware of it and see what kind of changes we can make so that producers and ranchers are kind of agile and kind of diligent about what is happening and kind of stay ahead of the game. So basically, what, in my opinion, this kind of COVID-19 gave us an opportunity to really kind of or give us many insights on how food consumption behavior could impact producers' net income, both the crop and livestock producers. So one thing is, it is important for us to scan the external environment, not only the weather, weather is another factor changing or could influence what we produce and how much we can produce and things like that. We need to look for leading indicators. So sometimes, for example, the Purdue study, which is a national representative survey, kind of give us some insights about consumer behavior changes. And then if those kind of stick, how am I going to respond? Is it better to go more diversified, more product differentiation, things like that. So I thought, I know many of you are very familiar with some of these issues, but I thought maybe it is of value to share it with you here. So that's all I have for now. So I don't know how we want to go about. Is it like questions or discussion or Jack? Thank you for listening.
Yep. Thank you, Deepthi. We can take some questions here. I don't know that I see any in the chat, or I think people can unmute and ask a question too, or we can move in. We can switch also to Andrea's presentation, and we'll should have some time as we finish too. So people can ask a question now, and many times on these, we find that our audience is very, very shy and doesn't come forward and ask questions. But if anybody has any, they're sure open to them. I thought it was interesting, Deepthi, on one of your first slides, the institutional food service, and we actually got. I felt it was institutional stuff had moved into our local grocery store just in the packaging of some of it. Yeah. They had 20-pound packages of bacon, and that was shortly after everything shut down, and they never had that, and I'm guessing it got moved out of institutional to that. So that was interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
And Heather just put in with a good idea. We'll just at the end we can stop the recording and we'll be open for questions too. So okay. we can do that. So if you can stop sharing, then Deepthi, then Andrea will be able to share hers. I think we've also had in South Dakota, just anecdotally, some of the local packing plants and local butchers have been very busy through this. Looks like I may have another. There's a comment in the chat.
Okay.
If you want to take that, or we can take it at the end too.
Yeah, that's I see the question about the beef industry of Wyoming. The question is about the law of marginal productivity and law of marginal returns to scale. They are kind of, I think the beef industry is taking the path of value-added product or product differentiation. So even though the scale may be low, the premium they get, right, will be, their idea is will be substantially higher enough to transmit that higher premium back to the producers. So that's what I think their business model is. I don't know whether that kind of answer the question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Andrea, we'll have you introduce yourself a little and then go ahead.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Andrea Leschewski. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that Deepthi introduced in the supply chain, looking specifically at our producers and our distributors and our consumers, some of the challenges faced by them, and how one specific USDA program tried to address some of those challenges. So looking at the Farmers to Families Food Box program. So this is my first time talking in the dialogues, so I figured I'd introduce myself before getting into talking about the program. I'm a assistant professor in the Ness school here at SDSU. This is my 5th year, and I both teach and do research here. So I teach a lot of our ag business courses as well as some marketing classes. And my research really focuses on taking a look at food and nutrition policy and spending time looking at our programs like SNAP, which is our modern day food stamp program, and nutrition education programs. And then I also take a look at consumer demand for different food products. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the challenges the program addresses, but just briefly highlight those, since Deepthi did such a nice job giving us an overview of those challenges. But what we're really going to be concerned with the Farmers to Family Food Box program are looking at the challenges faced by our producers, our distributors, and then our end consumers. So starting with production level. So we know when COVID hit, it had a big impact on our farmers and ranchers, right? So they had surplus commodity products on hand. And we also saw a big decrease in commodity prices following the start of the pandemic. So in the graph here, we've just got a few select commodities highlighting that decrease in commodity prices in the months immediately following the start of the pandemic. At the same time, we had our consumers struggling as well, but with kind of the opposite problem, right? So instead of low prices, consumers were faced with higher prices. So this chart is showing the food at home prices in the United States. So food at home is just food that you go to the grocery store to purchase and then you consume in your own home. So if we look at those prices in 2020 in this gray shaded area, we can see there's a huge spike in food at home prices when the pandemic began. So consumers were experiencing those price increases and finding it harder to be able to afford food, especially our low income households in the US. So that translated to higher rates of food insecurity. So food insecurity is just the idea that a household has enough food to eat in terms of quantity, but also nutritional quality. So they can have enough money to afford a diet that's good in terms of nutritional quality. So what the map here is showing is it's county level in the United States, looking at how did food insecurity change from 2019 before COVID to 2020 when COVID was already going on. So any county where you see a shaded orange, that indicates that food insecurity increased by at least 20% in that county, going from 2019 to 2020, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so at the same time, we've got consumers struggling, we've got producers struggling, we've also got distributors struggling in the supply chain. So there's not a lot of studies out on how they were impacted, but anecdotally, we know that with restaurants closing, distributors, are struggling to find work in many cases and to keep their employees on staff due to that. So we've kind of got this juxtaposition then. We've got our producers, they've got surplus commodities, they're facing low prices. And then on the other side, we've got our consumers who are facing higher food prices and often can't afford enough food and are having higher levels of food insecurity. So the USDA responded to this challenge by creating CFAP, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. So CFAP was primarily funded through the CARES Act associated with COVID. And the program, many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the direct payments that the program provided to ag producers. So the idea was for producers that were impacted by lower commodity prices or challenges with marketing their commodities, they could receive direct payments in many cases from USDA in this program. Lesser known is the other aspect of CFAP, which is the Farmers to Families Food Box Program. So that's what we're going to focus on today, and taking a look at the program itself, how it responded to the challenges we just talked about, and why the program was recently ended. So what were some of the big challenges with the program, and how did that influence the new policies that are in place today? So looking then at the Farmers to Family Food Box Program, it from 2020 to 2021 received about $6 billion of funding through CFAP. And the idea was that it was going to try to solve those challenges that we talked about in each of those stages of the supply chain. So it would help farmers that had surplus commodities. It would help put distributors back to work, and it would provide food to food insecure families. So what would happen in the program is the USDA would put out a call for applications. Distributors would then contract with the USDA to put together food boxes. And those food boxes would contain fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy products, and meat. Then those distributors would take the food boxes to nonprofits, and then the nonprofits would transfer those boxes to families in their community. So the idea was we'd be helping all those different stages in the supply chain, so we could keep distributors at work, improve food insecurity, and have some support for our farmers that were struggling due to COVID. Okay, so the program was in place for about a year, right? So it started call for applications in April of 2020, and it was officially ended at the end of May of this year. So just wanted to talk a bit about what the program did well, what were some of the successes of the program, and then take a look at what were some of the challenges that led to the program ending. So first we'll start with the positive. So what was good about the program? So this program was designed to address an emergency situation, right? So the pandemic was relatively unexpected, and we had producers and consumers and distributors that were struggling. We needed kind of an immediate response to help them. So one of the successes of the program was how fast it was put into place. So from the time the program was announced and they put out a call for applications to participate, they delivered the first food boxes within 45 days. So that's a pretty big success and quick turnaround for such a large program. The program also was successful in getting food out to US families. So they delivered about 175 million food boxes over the course of the past year. And it was also pretty successful in terms of helping our distributors in the supply chain. So anecdotally, distributors have credited the program to helping them keep their employees on staff, especially early on in the pandemic, and being able to stay in operation. And it also helped establish new supply chain relationships and collaboration. So between USDA and distributors, but also between farmers and ranchers and nonprofit organizations. I mean, we're going to see some of that collaboration carry over into the programs that are in place today that followed the food box program. Okay, so now we'll talk about the challenges or what went wrong with the food box program. So one of the biggest criticisms of the program was looking at inequitable distribution of benefits of the program. So one is at the consumer side. So this is looking at who's actually getting the food boxes in the US. So the idea is that hopefully we're helping families that are having trouble, that are food insecure, they don't have enough food to eat. But that wasn't a requirement of the program. So food boxes could go to any household who wanted to pick one up, not necessarily food insecure households. So if we're looking on the map here on the left, this is showing the number of food boxes that were distributed in a county per food insecure person. Okay, so ideally we would see a pretty similar level of food boxes distributed per person that's food insecure across all counties in the US, but that's not the case. Okay, so you can see the darker shaded counties benefited much more from the program than did other counties. So a lot of rural America here in the Midwest and Plains states was almost completely left out from receiving food boxes and benefiting on the consumer side for the program. Right. There's also some inequities in terms of distributors and farmers that were able to benefit from the program. So the food box program had 5 different rounds of funding. So there were applications to participate 5 different rounds. Within the first 2 rounds, they had over 200 farmers or distributors participating in the program to put together those food boxes and get them to the nonprofits. So that was a large number of distributors and smaller and medium-sized farmers that were benefiting from the program. As we went into rounds 3, 4, and 5 of funding, that dropped a lot, right? So anywhere from 31 to 54 distributors or farmers were participating in the program. So there's much more of a focus in rounds 3, 4, and 5 on lowering the cost of food boxes, but to do so, they were benefiting fewer distributors and farmers and ranchers, and really working with the larger distributors. Okay, another criticism of the program was it was benefiting some producers more than others. So for the food box, they required that it include certain items. So it had to have a certain weight of vegetables and fruit, had to include milk, it had to include cheese, but it didn't include other products like butter. So that wouldn't have been a requirement. So that had a pretty big impact on benefits for our producers, and we can see that in prices for products as well. So this is just highlighting 2 of them, but prices for cheese and butter in 2020. So again, cheese was a requirement. It had to be included in the food box, but butter was not. So you can see around the time the pandemic hit, there was a big decrease in price for both cheese and butter. The program was announced in April, started sending out food boxes towards June, and we see a pretty big uptick in the price for cheese, but not so much for butter. And there's this widening gap in the price between the 2, which is partly attributable to cheese being included in the food box program and there being increased demand for it, and butter not being included. So the program, by deciding what was included in the food box was essentially picking and choosing which producers would benefit from the program and which would not. Another issue was with the pricing of the food boxes. So when we're paying farmers and ranchers for the boxes and paying distributors for their services, all of that goes into the final price of each food box. So in the first couple of rounds of funding, the average or mean price of each box distributed was about $63, right? And the issue here was that the nonprofits that were giving the food boxes to families, they felt that if they were given $63, they could go to the store and buy more fresh products than were actually included in the boxes. So it was a challenge of weighing, helping consumers and giving them as much food as possible to help with food insecurity, but at the same time helping our producers and distributors and paying them enough for their products. And then anecdotally, distribution was a challenge with the program. So once distributors brought the food boxes that were put together to nonprofits, oftentimes there was a difficulty in getting those products to households before they spoiled. And so the nonprofits might not have the distribution capability or cold storage needed in order to do that successfully. So there's quite a bit of food waste with the program as well. Okay, so the program was ended again in May of this year. So just to finish up, talk a little bit about how the food box program motivated the policies that are in place today to continue to try to address those challenges in the food system due to COVID. So one of the replacements for the food box program was through TFAP, which is our Emergency Food Assistance Program. And they would continue to distribute food boxes to US households. What was different was instead of distributing boxes that had produce, dairy, and meat products, they only focused on produce. And they also cut out distributors. So now the food boxes would go directly from our farmers and ranchers locally to food banks. And then those food banks could decide to give them to food insecure households. So it was addressing some of those challenges with the Farmers to Family Food Box program, with distribution, with making sure boxes were going to families in need, and making sure we were helping smaller farmers and ranchers. And then the USDA, when the program, food box program ended, also started the dairy donation program to help our dairy producers. And that's a $400 million program to try to help prevent dumping milk. So getting that milk from farmers to food insecure consumers, again, by partnering with nonprofits. So for that donated milk, then farmers would be partially reimbursed by the USDA for that milk. So again, building off of that food box program, addressing some of the key challenges, but still trying to address the COVID-induced issues in the supply chain. So Farmers to Family Food Box program, I think it's a nice example of an emergency food assistance program that was in place to try to address COVID early on, that ended, but influenced the current policies that we now have in place. So I'll end there, and if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to talk a bit more about it with y'all.